The room expected her to break. The lawyer had seen it 100 times before. Hands shaking, voices rising, tears spilling onto paper that suddenly felt heavier than it should. Divorce rooms were usually loud, in quiet ways, even when no one shouted. Emotions leaked through clenched jaws and restless fingers. But this time, the silence was different. The pen rested in front of her, slim and polished, placed carefully where her name had already been underlined in blue. A single line, clean, decisive, final. Then one waited. Her husband sat across from her, spine straight, expression rehearsed into something that resembled calm. He had practiced this moment. He had walked into this office, certain of how it would go. There would be questions, resistance, maybe even anger, something that confirmed his importance in the ending of their marriage. She gave him none of that. She picked up the pen, not slowly enough to be dramatic, not quickly enough to appear careless, just calmly. She read the pages once, her eyes moving with steady focus, as if she were committing them to memory. When she reached the final page, she signed her name, without hesitation. No raised voice, no trembling hands, no fight. The lawyer blinked, then glanced at her again, almost suspicious, as though expecting a second version of her to appear and object. Her husband's jaw tightened. Her name was Seraphine Vale, and in that moment, without realizing it, she did something that would haunt him far more than anger ever could. She ended the marriage quietly. For 7 years, Seraphine had been married to Calder Rowan, a man known for certainty. In business circles, Calder's reputation was precise and formidable. He was the kind of who spoke once and expected alignment. Negotiations bent around his confidence. People admired his clarity, his discipline, his ability to make hard decisions without flinching. That certainty had once been what drew her to him. They hadn't started as strangers chasing ambition. They had been partners first, dreamers, two people who believed in building something together, love included. Back then, Calder listened when she spoke. He lingered in conversations. He remembered small details that made her feel seen rather than assessed. But success has a way of changing the tone of a life. Doesn't arrive loudly at first. It creeps in through packed schedules and postponed dinners, through meetings that run late and conversations reduced to summaries, through a growing belief that showing up financially excuses being absent emotionally. Seraphine noticed the shift long before the word divorce ever entered the room. It started quietly. Dinners grew infrequent, then optional, then forgotten. When Calder came home late, he carried the day with him like a shield, emails unanswered, calls unfinished, attention elsewhere. His phone rested face down more often than not. His responses shortened, stripped of warmth, delivered with efficiency instead of curiosity. She didn't confront him dramatically. She didn't accuse or demand. She tried gently. She asked questions with care, not suspicion. She suggested weekends away. She reminded him, softly, that presence mattered more than promises, that love needed time, not just results. But Calder had begun to believe that providing was enough. In his mind, the house, the security, the lifestyle, those were proof of love. Emotional closeness, he told himself, was a luxury they could return to once things slowed down. Things never slow down when you keep choosing distance. By the time he asked for the divorce, Seraphine had already lived inside loneliness for longer than he realized. He delivered the request the same way he delivered major decisions at work, clean, rehearsed, and confident. He spoke of growth, of different directions, of how people change. He didn't speak of neglect. He didn't speak of the nights she went to bed alone. He didn't speak of how often she felt like a guest in her own marriage. She listened when he finished. She nodded once. "All right," she said softly. That single word unsettled him more than any argument could have. He had expected resistance. What he received was acceptance, and acceptance, when it arrives without pleading, carries a finality that cannot be negotiated. The silence that followed her signature lingered even after she stood, thanked the lawyer politely, and walked out without looking back. Calder told himself her calm meant relief. That she had been waiting for this, too. That her lack of resistance confirmed his decision. But relief has a way of curdling when it isn't earned. By evening, unease had settled deep in his chest. Seraphine returned to the apartment they once shared, only to collect a small overnight bag. He didn't take jewelry. She didn't take framed photos or shared memories preserved in glass. She took only what she needed: clothes, a notebook, and the faint trace of a life she had already outgrown. She checked into a quiet hotel near the harbor, a place she had passed countless times without noticing. The room overlooked the water, where yachts rested like sleeping giants, their lights shimmering softly against the dark surface. She stood by the window for a long time, breathing. This wasn't grief the way she had imagined it would be. It was release. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like space, and within that space, something inside her finally had room to exhale. She didn't know yet that within hours, that same silence, the one that unsettled a room and rewrote an ending, would follow her somewhere no one expected. Somewhere that would make the world assume everything about her story was sudden. But the truth was simpler. Endings that appear quiet on the outside are usually loud on the inside long before anyone notices. And Seraphine had been leaving long before she ever signed her name. Seraphine lowered herself onto the edge of the bed and let the room exist without trying to fill it. For years, silence had followed her like a shadow, heavy, unwanted, pressing against her chest at night. It had lived between unanswered questions and half-finished conversations. It had sat across from her at dinner tables meant for two, and waited beside her in rooms that once echoed with shared plans. But this silence was different. This silence didn't ask her to endure. It allowed her to arrive. She slipped off her shoes and rested her feet against the cool floor, grounding herself in the present. Outside, the water shifted gently, patient and indifferent. The yachts remained still, their outlines soft against the darkness, as if even luxury knew how to rest. Her phone vibrated once on the bedside table. She didn't reach for it immediately. For years, every vibration had carried urgency. Work updates from Calder, last-minute changes, apologies wrapped in promises to make it up soon. She had trained herself to respond quickly, to be accommodating, to make space even when there was none left for her. Now, she let the phone vibrate into silence before finally picking it up. No messages from Calder. That, too, told her everything. She opened her notebook instead. The first page was blank, intimidating in its honesty. She had once filled notebooks effortlessly. Ideas, reflections, half-finished thoughts, scribbled during mornings that belonged to her. Over time, the pages had stayed empty. There had always been something more pressing, something more important, something that required her to wait. She turned the pen slowly between her fingers. "What do you want now?" she whispered to herself. The question felt unfamiliar. For so long, her wants had been adjusted, postponed, softened to fit someone else's schedule. Wanting had become inconvenient. Expecting had felt selfish. Somewhere along the way, she had learned to measure her needs against Calder's priorities and lose every time. She wrote one sentence: "I want peace." The simplicity of it surprised her. Not revenge, not answers, not validation, just peace. Across the city, Calder stood alone in the apartment they had once shared, staring at the place where Seraphine's coat usually hung. He hadn't noticed when she stopped leaving it there. He hadn't noticed a lot of things. The apartment felt different without her presence. Too orderly, too controlled. Silence pressed in from all sides, unsoftened by her quiet movements or the subtle warmth she brought into every room without demanding attention. He poured himself a drink he didn't want and stood by the window, watching the city lights blink on one by one. He told himself he felt fine. This was what he had asked for. Still, something gnawed at him. He replayed the scene in the lawyer's office, again and again. Her calm, her composure, the way she didn't look at him when she signed. No bargaining, no emotion to negotiate with. Felt wrong. Endings, in his experience, came with friction. Resistance meant importance. Emotion meant investment. Her silence had offered neither. For the first time, Calder wondered, not whether the divorce was right, but when it had truly begun. Back at the harbor, Seraphine closed her notebook and rested against the headboard, exhaustion settling over her gently rather than crushing her. Didn't cry. She didn't force herself to feel anything dramatic. She let the day be what it was. An ending, yes, but also an opening. Her phone lit up again. This time, she looked. A name appeared on the screen she hadn't expected to see tonight. Aurelius Blackmore. They had met months earlier at a charity event. Neither of them had wanted to attend for the reasons it advertised. He had stood beside her during a quiet moment, both of them observing rather than performing. Their conversation had been unhurried, thoughtful. Two people speaking without agendas. They had exchanged numbers without ceremony. Nothing had come of it. Till now, the message was brief. "I heard you might need fresh air tonight." She read it twice. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't assumed anything. He hadn't crossed a line, just an invitation. Seraphine set the phone down and exhaled slowly. For the first time all day, she smiled. Not because of the message itself, but because she realized something quietly powerful. She had options, not obligations, not expectations. Options? She picked up the phone again. "Yes," she typed. "I think I do." As she sent the message, she didn't know yet how the night would unfold. She didn't know how a photograph would later travel farther than intention ever could. She didn't know how silence, once mistaken for weakness, was about to rewrite the story others thought they understood. What she did know was this: she hadn't argued the divorce, because there was nothing left to defend. And sometimes the most life-changing choices are made not in moments of chaos, but in moments of calm clarity, when you finally stop asking to be chosen and start choosing yourself. That was where her story truly began. The harbor greeted her with quiet certainty. When Seraphine stepped out of the car, the night air brushed her skin gently, carrying the faint scent of salt and something cleaner. Possibility, perhaps. The water stretched out before her, dark and calm, reflecting pinpricks of light that trembled but never broke. The yacht waited a short distance away, anchored just beyond the marina lights. It wasn't ostentatious. No blaring music. No spectacle. Its presence was assured rather than loud, the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Aurelius stood near the edge of the dock when she approached, hands loosely clasped behind his back, posture relaxed. He looked exactly as she remembered, composed, observant. A man who seemed to listen even when no one was speaking. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. There was no awkwardness between them. No need to explain the day she'd had. No expectation of disclosure. That, she realized, was the first gift of the evening. They boarded quietly. As the yacht pulled away from the dock, Seraphine felt something loosen inside her. Not excitement exactly, but relief. The city drifted farther behind them, its noise fading into a distant hum, as though the world itself were giving her permission to step out of its demands for a while. They dined beneath the open sky. Conversation came easily, not because it dazzled, but because it didn't demand performance. Aurelius asked questions and waited for the answers. When she paused, he didn't rush to fill the space. He noticed her silences and respected them. She told him, in simple terms, that her marriage had ended that day. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask why. He nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth that needed no examination. "Endings," he said quietly, "are rarely as sudden as they look." Something in her chest softened. She realized how rare it was to be understood without having to justify yourself. They spoke about art, about travel, about the strange loneliness that came with full calendars and empty conversations. She laughed, softly at first, almost surprised by the sound of it. When she did, Aurelius smiled, not with interest, but with recognition. For the first time in years, Seraphine felt seen without being assessed. Not as a role, not as a support system, just as herself. Across the city, Calder's evening unraveled in slow, uncomfortable fragments. He wandered through the apartment restlessly, stopping in rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar. He noticed small absences: Seraphine's notebook gone from the coffee table, her favorite mug missing from the cabinet. These weren't things he'd consciously registered before. They mattered now. His phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. Something trivial, something urgent, something he would normally handle without thought. He stared at the screen, then set the phone aside, untouched. For the first time in years, he didn't know where his wife was. That realization should not have mattered. But it did. Later, almost by accident, the truth reached him. A photo, shared casually, almost carelessly. A yacht silhouetted against the water. Soft lights. And there, unmistakably, was Seraphine. Her posture was relaxed, her expression unreadable from the distance, but her presence unmistakable. Calder's breath caught, not because she had moved on, but because she had done so without chaos, without announcement, without ever needing him to notice. It struck him then, with a clarity he couldn't avoid. Her silence hadn't been indifference. It had been departure. Back on the water, Seraphine stood near the railing, the wind lifting her hair gently. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt steady. She made no promises to herself that night. No declarations. No dramatic turning points. She simply allowed herself to experience ease, something she had been denied for far too long. That night did not change her life because of where she was. It changed her life because of who she finally allowed herself to be. Someone who no longer argued for space. Someone who no longer waited to be chosen. Someone who understood that peace is not something you negotiate for. It's something you step into when you stop explaining your worth. And though the world would later assume the story was about a billionaire's yacht, the truth was quieter and far more powerful. It was about a woman who learned that silence, when chosen, can be the loudest answer of all. If this story is already speaking to you, take a moment to pause. Have you ever stayed calm on the outside while everything inside you was changing? Have you ever realized you stopped arguing, not because you agreed, but because you were done explaining yourself? If this feels familiar, let me know in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you're drawn to stories about love, loss, quiet strength, and the lessons we learn when life forces us to choose ourselves, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the truths hidden inside them. Chapter 2 goes deeper into how love slowly fades long before anyone notices, and why waiting too long can change everything. Calder used to listen. That was the detail Seraphine returned to most often, not with longing, but with clarity. In the early days of their marriage, listening had been his quiet strength. He didn't interrupt. He didn't glance at his phone while she spoke. When she explained an idea, a fear, or a half-formed dream, he leaned in as if it mattered simply because it came from her. Back then, love had felt collaborative. They were younger, still shaping themselves, still convinced that success and intimacy could grow side by side without one overshadowing the other. Even when Calder's ambitions began to sharpen, they had spoken about it openly. Late nights were temporary. Pressure was no. Everything had an explanation, a timeline, a promise attached. Seraphine had believed those promises. She had believed in patience, the way some people believed in destiny. Not blindly, but faithfully. She understood effort. She understood sacrifice. She had never needed extravagance to feel secure. What she needed was presence, consistency, and the sense that she mattered beyond convenience. For a while, she did. Calder's rise was swift and, at first, exhilarating. New opportunities appeared weekly. Meetings turned into deals. Deals turned into headlines. People began to speak his name with admiration edged in caution. He carried himself differently, not arrogantly but decisively, as though the world had finally begun to confirm what he had always known about himself. Seraphine stood beside him, steady and proud. She attended events she didn't care about, smiled through conversations that felt performative, and learned the rhythm of a life dictated by calendars and expectations. She told herself this was partnership, that seasons required flexibility, that love adapted, but adaptation, she would later learn, is not the same as erasure. The first shift was subtle enough to excuse. Dinner plans postponed, then rescheduled, then forgotten entirely. When Calder came home late, he brought the weight of the day with him. Conversations shortened. Questions went unanswered. When she asked how his day had been, he replied with outcomes instead of experiences, numbers, decisions, victories, never feelings. She noticed how often his phone sat between them on the table, screen dark but present, as if reminding her that something else always waited for his attention. Still, she didn't complain. She adjusted. She ate alone when he worked late. She learned to enjoy quiet evenings without interpreting them as rejection. She told herself love didn't need constant reassurance. She told herself not to be demanding. She told herself that independence was strength. What she didn't realize was how easily strength could become silence. On weekends, she suggested small escapes, walks, dinners, trips that didn't require schedules. Calder agreed sometimes, half present, even when he did. His mind remained elsewhere, scanning problems, anticipating the next move. She would watch him from across the table, noticing how rarely his eyes softened now, how his listening had become transactional, waiting for his turn to speak rather than absorbing what she said. Once, gently, she mentioned it. "I miss talking to you," she said, careful not to sound accusing. He smiled distractedly. "We talk all the time." She almost corrected him. "But she didn't, because explaining loneliness to someone who doesn't feel it requires energy she was already running out of. The house grew quieter in ways she couldn't name. Not empty, just distant. Like two people living parallel, lives under the same roof, intersecting only when necessary. Calder believed everything was fine. From his perspective, nothing was broken. He provided. He showed up when it mattered. He assumed love was stable, like infrastructure, built once and maintained by default. He didn't see the small moments slipping through his fingers. He didn't notice when Seraphine stopped waiting up for him. He didn't notice when she stopped initiating conversations that required vulnerability. He didn't notice when she began writing less, not because she lacked ideas, but because she no longer felt inspired in a life where her inner world remained unseen. She still cared. That was the dangerous part. Care kept her trying. She softened her needs, lowered expectations, learned to accept partial presence as normal. When disappointment surfaced, she swallowed it and told herself she was being unreasonable. After all, Calder worked hard. After all, success required focus. After all, this was marriage, wasn't it? But marriage, she would later understand, is not sustained by effort alone. It is sustained by attention. One evening, after another missed dinner, she sat at the kitchen table long after the food had gone cold. The house was quiet, illuminated only by the light above her. She stared at the untouched plate, then at the door. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of reminding. Tired of waiting. Tired of making space for someone who never noticed how much space she was giving. That night, something shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. She didn't decide to leave. She decided to stop asking. From that point on, Seraphine began pulling inward, not as punishment, not as strategy, but as preservation. She spoke less, asked fewer questions, filled her time with solitary routines that required no negotiation. Calder noticed none of it. In his world, silence meant peace, efficiency, stability. He didn't understand that when someone stops asking, it's rarely because they've stopped caring. It's because they've stopped believing they'll be heard. And that, quietly, is where love begins to erode, not with betrayal, not with cruelty, but with the slow normalization of absence. By the time Calder would later insist that the divorce came suddenly, Seraphine would know the truth. It had been happening for years, and this chapter of her story, unseen, unacknowledged, and unspoken, was where the ending truly began. Calder believed he was doing everything right. That belief settled in slowly, reinforced by results. Promotions, recognition, numbers that kept climbing. In his world, effort was measurable, and success followed logic. If something worked, you continued. If it didn't, you optimized. Marriage to him felt the same. He provided stability, security, a future that looked impressive from the outside. When problems arose, he assumed they would announce themselves clearly, the way issues did at work, through conflict, complaint, or failure. Seraphine did none of those things. So Calder assumed there was nothing to fix. When he came home late, she no longer waited by the door. When he forgot plans, she stopped reminding him. When he spoke about work for long stretches without asking about her day, she listened politely and offered encouragement. From his perspective, she seemed easier, calm, more independent. He didn't understand that what looked like ease was withdrawal. Seraphine had begun rationing herself. She learned which conversations led nowhere and avoided them. She noticed which emotions felt inconvenient to share and kept them private. She stopped expecting curiosity and accepted politeness instead. At first, this felt like maturity. She told herself this was what long-term relationships evolved into: less intensity, more efficiency, less emotion, more structure. She reminded herself that love wasn't always exciting, that comfort mattered. But comfort without connection slowly becomes distance. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when Calder sensed something slipping. Sometimes he would catch her watching him, not with admiration or irritation, but with a kind of quiet assessment, as if she were noticing him for the first time from a distance. "Everything okay?" he'd ask, half distracted. "Yes," she'd reply, and because she didn't argue, he believed her. He never questioned why her laughter softened, why her stories shortened, why her dreams, once shared freely, stayed locked behind careful smiles. He didn't notice that she had stopped imagining a future that included him emotionally. One evening, he returned home earlier than usual, expecting surprise or appreciation. Instead, he found Seraphine seated at the table, writing. Not working, not scrolling. "Writing?" She looked up, startled, then smiled politely. "Didn't expect you so soon," she said. He nodded, glanced at the notebook, then away again. Just a change in schedule. He waited for more. She returned to her page. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. For the first time, Calder felt like a guest in his own home. He didn't know how to name the feeling, so he dismissed it. Seraphine, on the other hand, recognized the moment clearly. It was the first time she realized she no longer oriented her inner world around his presence. His early arrival didn't excite her. His absence no longer disappointed her. It simply didn't move her. That realization frightened her more than anger ever could have. She still loved him, but love, she was learning, could exist alongside resignation. And resignation, once it takes root, quietly rearranges priorities. She began choosing herself in small, almost invisible ways. She spent mornings alone with her thoughts instead of waiting for conversation. She took longer walks. She revisited old interests without asking if they fit into his schedule. She stopped explaining why certain things mattered to her, not because they stopped mattering, but because she stopped needing his acknowledgement to validate them. Calder noticed the efficiency. The house ran smoothly. There were fewer emotional conversations, less friction. From his perspective, the marriage had stabilized. He didn't understand that stability built on silence is temporary, because what he mistook for peace was simply the absence of resistance. And resistance, when it disappears, doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it means departure has already begun. By the time Calder would later frame the divorce as a mutual decision, Seraphine would already know the truth. She hadn't left because he asked. She had stayed until she no longer recognized herself in the staying. And that was the lesson quietly unfolding, one neither of them fully understood yet. Neglect doesn't end relationships all at once. It teaches people how to live without being seen. And once someone learns that lesson too well, they don't argue when it's time to go. When trying slowly turns into waiting, Seraphine didn't stop trying all at once. That would have been too obvious, too easy to explain. Instead, her effort thinned gradually, like fabric worn soft by time. At first, it was still there, visible, intentional, carefully placed. She continued to show up, continued to ask questions that invited closeness, continued to make room for a connection she believed only needed patience to revive. She adjusted her expectations first. If Calder couldn't make dinner, she told herself it was reasonable. His work was demanding. His responsibilities were real. Love, she believed, was flexible. It stretched. It understood. If conversations felt rushed, she reminded herself that timing mattered. There would be quieter seasons. Things would slow down eventually. So she waited. Waiting became her most practiced skill. She waited for him to notice when she dressed carefully, not for attention, but for recognition. She waited for him to ask about her writing, the way he once had. She waited for the curiosity that used to feel natural between them to return without prompting. In the meantime, she kept giving. She offered encouragement when he doubted himself. She listened when he vented. She absorbed the weight of his days and made space for his ambitions, even when they crowded out her own. The outside, she looked supportive, strong, secure. Inside, she was quietly learning what it felt like to be optional. The shift was subtle enough that even she questioned it at first. Was she being sensitive? Was she expecting too much? Was this simply what long-term love became? She didn't want to be unreasonable. She didn't want to demand reassurance like a debt owed. So she softened her needs and translated disappointment into understanding. But understanding, when it flows only one way, slowly erodes self-worth. She noticed it one evening. While getting ready for bed, Calder sat at the edge of the mattress, phone in hand, responding to messages that carried urgency she no longer felt she could compete with. She stood in front of the mirror, watching her own reflection as she brushed her hair. She looked the same, but she felt distant from herself. When she spoke, it was carefully. "I've feeling a little invisible lately," she said. The words landed gently, No accusation. No edge. Calder glanced up, surprised, not defensive. Invisible? He repeated, as though trying to locate the problem logically. She nodded. I know you're busy. I just miss us. He reached for her hand, squeezed it briefly. You know I appreciate you. Things are just intense right now. She waited for more. Didn't come. That night, lying beside him in the dark, she stared at the ceiling, long after his breathing evened out. She realized she was doing something she had never done before. She was rehearsing her feelings privately, editing them before sharing, anticipating dismissal before it happened. That was new, and it frightened her. From that moment on, something inside her recalibrated. She didn't stop loving him. She stopped centering him. The change showed up in small decisions. She no longer rearranged her schedule around his uncertainty. She pursued her interests without asking if they aligned with his timeline. She stopped preparing emotional conversations that required him to meet her halfway, not out of resentment, out of self-protection. Calder experienced the change as ease. There were fewer emotional discussions, less tension, less expectation. To him, it felt like the relationship had matured into something simpler, more manageable. He didn't understand that simplicity built on silence is fragile. Seraphine's care hadn't disappeared. It had retreated inward, and care, when turned inward for too long, begins to teach a dangerous lesson that you can survive without being chosen. Once that lesson takes hold, love no longer feels urgent. Connection becomes optional, and staying becomes a habit rather than a desire. She still smiled, still supported him, still showed up, but no longer waited with her whole heart. And waiting, when it loses hope, quietly transforms into preparation. She didn't know it yet, but this was the chapter where effort finally began turning into something else. Not anger, not bitterness, readiness. Waiting changed shape. At first, it had felt active, hopeful even. Seraphine waited with intention, believing patience was an expression of love. She told herself that commitment meant endurance, that understanding meant flexibility, that strong relationships survived seasons of imbalance. But over time, waiting became passive. She no longer waited for moments to improve. She waited for moments to pass. That distinction mattered more than she realized. The shift showed itself in how she spoke. Her sentences shortened. Her questions softened into statements. She stopped framing her thoughts in ways that invited discussion and began keeping them to herself instead. Not because Calder wouldn't listen, but because she had learned how little changed when he did. One afternoon, she caught herself making plans without considering him at all. Not out of spite, simply out of habit. She scheduled her days around her own energy, her own interests, her own quiet needs. The realization startled her. She had always thought detachment arrived with anger, with slammed doors and final conversations and dramatic exits. But this detachment arrived politely, It arrived with courtesy, with smiles, with understanding nods that required nothing in return. Calder mistook this for harmony. From his perspective, the relationship had become easier. There were fewer emotionally charged conversations, less need to explain, less pressure to respond in ways that demanded vulnerability. He told himself this was growth. He didn't see the cost. Seraphine had begun practicing emotional independence while still married. And emotional independence, once established, rarely reverses itself. There were moments when Calder sensed distance, but he dismissed them quickly. Work trained him to identify problems through data, complaints, conflicts, performance drops. Seraphine offered none of these, so he assumed all was well. He didn't realize that when someone stops expressing dissatisfaction, it's often because they've stopped expecting change. One evening, she watched him from across the room as he spoke animatedly on the phone, discussing strategy with a colleague. His energy was sharp, focused, engaged. He listened intently, responded thoughtfully, asked clarifying questions. She recognized that version of him. It was the version she used to talk to. That was the moment clarity settled in, not as pain, but as understanding. He hadn't lost the ability to connect. He had redirected it. That truth hurt more than neglect ever had. She didn't confront him. She didn't demand explanations. She simply accepted what was. And acceptance, she learned, is not the same as agreement. From that point on, she began letting go in ways so subtle they went unnoticed. She stopped imagining future milestones together, stopped planning shared goals, stopped anchoring her sense of self to the idea of us. She still showed care, still respected him, still honored the history they shared. But she stopped waiting for him to return to a version of himself that had already moved on. Waiting, when prolonged, teaches a lesson most people never intend to teach. That presence is optional. That affection is negotiable. That your needs can remain unmet without consequence. And once that lesson is learned too deeply, the person waiting begins to change, not into someone angry, but into someone ready. Seraphine didn't know when the end would come. She just knew she was no longer afraid of it. That knowledge didn't arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, like a door unlocking from the inside. By the time Calder would later sit across from her in a lawyer's office, convinced the conversation was just beginning, Seraphine would already be somewhere else entirely. This was the chapter where patience stopped being proof of love and became a warning. Not to him, to herself, because love that requires you to disappear while you wait is not love that can survive. And once someone understands that, they don't argue when the moment finally arrives. They simply sign. Seraphine's realization didn't arrive with tears. That surprised her most. She had always assumed clarity would feel dramatic, like something breaking open, like grief demanding to be witnessed. Instead, it came quietly, during an ordinary afternoon that held no significance until she understood it. She was folding laundry. The task was simple, almost automatic. Warm fabric, familiar motions. The house settled around her in its usual stillness. Calder wasn't home yet. He wouldn't be for hours. As she folded one of his shirts, she paused, not because of sentiment, because she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt connected to the man who wore it. The absence of feeling was unmistakable. Not anger, not sadness, just distance. It dawned on her then that she had already grieved the marriage, slowly, privately, over years. The late nights, the unanswered questions, the quiet disappointments she had learned to swallow and rename as understanding. She had done the emotional work of leaving long before anyone asked her to go. That was the truth she hadn't allowed herself to say out loud. She sat down on the edge of the couch and let the realization settle. She wasn't waiting anymore, not for him to notice, not for things to change, not for permission to feel differently. She had crossed a line internally, a line people rarely see, but always feel when they step over it. On the other side of that line, longing gives way to acceptance. Hope gives way to honesty. And honesty, once embraced, doesn't argue with reality. That evening, when Calder came home later than expected, she didn't feel disappointment. She didn't check the time. She didn't wonder why. She simply acknowledged his presence when he entered the room. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive," he replied, loosening his tie. "Long?" she nodded. The exchange felt complete. That should have concerned him. But it didn't, because to Calder, the absence of tension felt like success. In his mind, relationships functioned best when they were efficient, when problems didn't surface, when emotional labor was minimal. He didn't recognize that what he interpreted as stability was actually surrender. Over the following weeks, Seraphine moved through her days with a sense of internal order she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't withdraw from life. She didn't shut down emotionally. She simply stopped orienting herself around him. She made decisions without checking in, planned days without accounting for his schedule, invested energy into things that restored her instead of draining her. Calder noticed the smoothness. The house felt calm, predictable, easy. He didn't ask why. He didn't question why she no longer asked about his future plans or how she fit into them. He didn't notice that when he spoke about the years ahead, she listened without inserting herself into the picture. He assumed alignment. In reality, she had already stepped away. The decision to stop asking had done something irreversible. It had shown her how much emotional space she had been giving away and how peaceful it felt to reclaim it. That peace frightened her at first. She worried it meant she had become cold, detached, unfeeling, but she hadn't lost her capacity to love. She had lost her willingness to beg for it. One night, lying awake beside Calder as he slept, she studied his profile in the dim light. She felt tenderness for who he had been, for what they had once shared. But tenderness alone was no longer enough. Love, she understood now, was not meant to be endured quietly. It was meant to be shared actively, and she had been alone in it for too long. By the time Calder would eventually frame the divorce as a rational next step, something mutual, something reasonable, Seraphine would already understand the deeper truth. The ending wasn't a decision they made together. It was a decision she had finished making long before he ever spoke it aloud. And once a decision is complete internally, no argument can change it. Because you don't argue with clarity. You act on it. Calder noticed the change only after it had settled in. It wasn't obvious at first. There were no confrontations, no emotional storms to signal trouble. If anything, Seraphine seemed easier to be around. She no longer pressed for conversations late at night. She didn't circle back to unfinished discussions. She didn't ask questions that required him to slow down and reflect. From Calder's perspective, the marriage had become efficient, and efficiency, to him, felt like success. He mistook her calm for contentment. What he didn't understand was that calm can exist without connection, and when it does, it usually means someone has stopped fighting for closeness. Seraphine's clarity had settled into her quietly. It guided her choices without demanding attention. She woke earlier than usual, savoring the mornings before the house stirred. She wrote again, not for productivity, but for truth. Pages filled with thoughts she no longer felt the need to translate into conversations that led nowhere. Writing reminded her who she was before she learned to make herself smaller. She didn't share this with Calder, not because she was hiding anything, but because she no longer needed his validation to continue. One evening, as they ate dinner together for the first time in weeks, Calder studied her across the table. She looked the same, sounded the same, but something about her felt finished. "You seem different lately," he said casually, more curious than concerned. She looked up, met his gaze without hesitation. "Different? How?" He shrugged. "Calmer. Like things don't bother you as much." She smiled softly. "Things don't." He nodded, satisfied. That was the moment she understood something with painful clarity. He didn't miss her presence. He missed the absence of friction. The following weeks unfolded with the same quiet rhythm. Calder stayed busy. Seraphine stayed grounded. They moved around each other with politeness and respect, like people who shared history but no longer shared direction. Then, one evening, Calder asked her to sit down. The tone of his voice was familiar, the one he used when he had reached a conclusion and expected agreement. He spoke carefully, deliberately, as though managing risk. "I've been thinking," he began, "about us, about where we're headed." She listened, without interruption. He spoke of growth, of change, of how people evolve, of how sometimes the most responsible decision is to acknowledge that two people want different things. He framed the divorce as practical, clean, inevitable. When he finished, He waited. This was the moment he expected. Emotion. Questions. Resistance. Negotiation. Seraphine nodded once. "All right," she said quietly. The word landed heavier than any argument could have. Calder blinked. "That's it?" "Yes." He searched her face for something. Hurt, disbelief, anger, something to engage with, something to respond to. There was nothing there. "What about talking it through?" he asked. She considered the question carefully before answering. "We already did," she said, "just not out loud." That was when discomfort flickered across his certainty. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't surprised. She had been ready. They met with the lawyer. Days later, Calder expected logistics to dominate the conversation. What he hadn't expected was how unsettled he would feel watching her sign without hesitation. No fight, no tears, no delay. Her silence was decisive. And as she stood to leave the office, thanking the lawyer politely, Calder felt something tighten in his chest. Not relief, not regret exactly, but confusion. How could something so final feel so quiet? Seraphine walked out knowing something important. She hadn't been brave in that room. She had simply been honest. Honest about what had already ended. Honest about what no longer needed saving. Clarity had done the work long before the papers ever appeared. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't argue. It moves on. Seraphine packed lightly. That's surprised her. She had expected the act of leaving to feel heavier, to require decisions that pulled at memory and meaning. Instead, her hands moved with quiet certainty, selecting only what she needed and leaving behind what no longer belonged to the life she was stepping into. She didn't take jewelry, not because it lacked value, but because it carried weight. She didn't want to measure anymore. She didn't take framed photographs or shared keepsakes arranged carefully on shelves. Those memories didn't need to be carried, to be honored. She took clothes, a notebook, a few books she had once loved before time made them unfamiliar. That what? The apartment looked unchanged when she finished. Clean, orderly, almost untouched, like a space designed to be impressive rather than lived in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, waiting for emotion to catch up with action. It didn't. Instead, she felt something gentler. Relief. She closed the door behind her without ceremony. The hotel near the harbor welcomed her with understated quiet. No grand entrance, no polished performance, just calm lighting, soft textures, and the distant sound of water shifting outside. Her room overlooked the marina. Yachts rested along the edge of the water, their lights reflecting in slow, wavering patterns. They looked like they belonged to another world, untouched by urgency, unbothered by explanations. Seraphine stood by the window for a long time, breathing. She had imagined grief as something sharp and immediate, something that demanded attention. But what she felt instead was space, room to think, room to exist without adjusting herself to someone else's expectations. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle. For years, silence had felt like abandonment, an absence she endured rather than chose. Now, it felt intentional, protective, almost kind. She realized then how much energy she had spent explaining herself, explaining why she felt lonely, explaining why presence mattered, explaining why love required more than provision. Now, there was nothing left to explain. Her phone lay untouched on the bedside table. She didn't check it for messages from Calder. She didn't wait for acknowledgement or reaction. That chapter was already closed, not with bitterness, but with finality. Instead, she reached for her notebook. The blank page greeted her honestly. She wrote slowly at first, testing the shape of her thoughts without filtering them for approval. Words came easily, surprising her with their clarity. She didn't write about anger or blame. She wrote about noticing, about how people drift without meaning to, about how silence can be mistaken for peace until it becomes permanent. Writing reminded her of something important. She hadn't lost herself. She had postponed herself. Outside, the water moved steadily, indifferent to the changes unfolding above it. Seraphine watched the reflection shift and understood something with sudden certainty. Loss and release can look identical from the outside, but on the inside, they feel very different. This wasn't the ache of something taken from her. It was the calm of something returned. She lay back on the bed, hands folded loosely at her sides, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, her thoughts didn't revolve around what she should do next or how she should feel. They simply existed, and within that quiet, she felt something unfamiliar but welcome settle in her chest. Peace, not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's choices. The durable kind that comes from choosing yourself. She didn't know yet how the night would unfold. She didn't know how quickly the world would misinterpret what came next. But she knew this much. She hadn't left to be She hadn't left to be seen. She had left to breathe. And that choice, quiet, uncelebrated, and deeply personal, was the beginning of a life she no longer had to argue for. The night settled slowly, as if even time had decided not to rush her. Seraphine changed into comfortable clothes and sat by the window again, watching the harbor lights sway gently against the dark water. The city behind her felt distant, its noise muted, its urgency irrelevant. For years, she had lived according to other people's momentum. Now, nothing pulled at her. That absence felt strange, not empty, unclaimed. Her phone vibrated once on the table. She noticed it, acknowledged it, and continued watching the water. That alone told her how much had changed. Eventually, she reached for the phone, not out of anticipation, but curiosity. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't expected, yet somehow wasn't surprised to see. Aurelius Blackmore. They had met months earlier at a charity event, Neither of them had stayed long enough to enjoy. Their conversation had been brief, but unhurried, marked by something rare: mutual attention. He hadn't dominated the exchange, or treated it like an introduction that needed to impress. He had simply been present. They had exchanged numbers casually, without expectation. The message was short. "I hope you're well. I heard you're near the harbor tonight." She read it twice, considering not the invitation, but how it made her feel. It didn't feel invasive, didn't feel urgent. It felt respectful. Seraphine typed slowly, "I am. And yes, I am near the water." She set the phone down and exhaled. For the first time, she noticed something important about herself. She wasn't reaching for distraction. She wasn't trying to fill a void or escape discomfort. She was simply responding to an option. That distinction mattered. Minutes later, another message appeared. "If you'd like some fresh air, you're welcome aboard. No pressure." No pressure. Those words landed gently. She smiled to herself, not because of the invitation, but because she realized she could decline without consequence. The choice was hers entirely. She looked at her reflection in the window, not searching, not waiting, grounded. "Yes," she replied. "I'd like that." The walk to the dock was quiet, the air cool against her skin. Each step felt intentional, not rushed. She wasn't heading toward anything dramatic. She was simply following curiosity. The yacht rested a short distance from the pier, elegant, without excess. Its presence was calm, assured, like someone comfortable in their own space. Aurelius greeted her with the same composure she remembered. No probing questions, no assumptions, just a warm acknowledgement of her arrival. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I," she answered honestly. They sat beneath the open sky as the yacht drifted gently away from the dock. Conversation unfolded naturally, not as an exchange of facts, but as a sharing of perspective. She spoke about art she loved, about writing she had returned to, about the quiet clarity that comes when something ends without resistance. Aurelius listened, really listened. He didn't rush to interpret or respond. He let her words settle before answering, as if honoring the space between sentences. When she mentioned the divorce, only briefly, he didn't offer sympathy or solutions. He simply nodded. "Some endings," he said, "are quieter because they've already been lived." The truth of it resonated deeply. Seraphine felt no rush to define what the evening meant. She didn't frame it as moving on or starting over. She experienced it as something simpler, a reminder of what ease feels like when connection isn't forced. Across the city, Calder stood alone in the apartment, noticing the quiet for the first time. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish and stared at the place where Seraphine's notebook used to sit. The silence pressed differently now. Not peaceful, not efficient, unanswered. He checked his phone once, twice, nothing. For the first time, the absence unsettled him. Back on the water, Seraphine leaned against the railing, the breeze lifting her hair gently. She wasn't thinking about Calder. She wasn't proving anything to anyone. She was present, and that, she realized, was the most educational truth of all. Healing doesn't announce itself. Growth doesn't argue. And moving forward doesn't always look like running toward something new. Sometimes it looks like standing still long enough to realize you're already free. Before we continue, take a moment to sit with this chapter. Have you ever realized that what looked like loss was actually relief? That walking away didn't break you. It finally gave you room to breathe. If this part of the story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading them may be standing at the same crossroads. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet strength, emotional clarity, and the lessons love teaches us when we stop forcing it, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Every story here is meant to entertain, but also to help us grow. In the next chapter, we'll explore how healthy connection feels when it's not rushed, not demanded, and not built on rescue. Why that difference changes everything. Aurelius never hurried the moment. That was the first thing Seraphine noticed as the yacht moved farther from the dock. There was no agenda to impress her, no attempt to turn the evening into something larger than it needed to be. The city lights receded slowly, and with them, the noise of expectation she had lived under for years. She hadn't realized how exhausting expectation was until it was gone. They sat across from one another, a small table between them, the open sky above. The water shifted gently, carrying them forward without asking where they were headed. It felt symbolic in a way she didn't need to articulate. Aurelius poured water into 2 glasses and slid one toward her. "You don't owe me a story," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Only conversation, if you want it." She smiled, appreciative of the boundary. "Conversation sounds right," she replied. They spoke first about simple things, places they loved, books that had stayed with them long after they were finished. The odd loneliness that can exist even in full rooms, especially when your role becomes more visible than your inner life. Seraphine found herself talking freely, not because she needed to be heard urgently, but because she felt safe enough not to rush. That difference mattered. Aurelius listened the way Calder once had, before success sharpened his focus into something narrow and unforgiving. But there was something else here, too. Something steadier, less ambition-driven, more present. When Seraphine mentioned her writing, Aurelius didn't ask what it was for, or whether it would lead somewhere. He asked what it gave her. The question startled her. "It reminds me who I am," she said after a moment. He nodded, as if that answer needed no expansion. This, she realized, was what healthy attention felt like. Not probing, not evaluating, not trying to fix, just noticing. She thought of how often she had explained herself in her marriage, how she had framed her needs carefully, softened her words, waited for the right timing that never came. Sitting here now, she felt no urge to perform or justify. She wasn't being rescued. She was being respected. That distinction anchored her. Aurelius spoke then, not about himself, but about the idea of connection. "People confuse intensity with intimacy," he said quietly. "But Intensity fades. Presence doesn't. Seraphine looked out over the water as his words settled. In her past, love had been intense, full of urgency, sacrifice, and effort. She had mistaken endurance for depth, patience for loyalty. This felt different. There was no rush to define anything, no need to declare intentions, no promise implied by proximity. The evening unfolded gently, almost invisibly. Food was served without ceremony. Conversation drifted and returned. Silence appeared occasionally. Not awkward, not heavy, just there. She realized something important in those quiet spaces. It wasn't waiting for him to choose her. She was choosing whether she enjoyed being there. And she did. Across the city, Calder sat alone with the growing realization that something fundamental had shifted. The apartment felt unfamiliar in a way he couldn't rationalize. He checked his phone again, then set it face down on the table. He had expected Seraphine's absence to feel temporary. Instead, it felt settled. Back on the yacht, Seraphine leaned against the railing, letting the breeze cool her skin. She wasn't thinking about what the night meant tomorrow. She wasn't assigning meaning or projecting outcomes. She was present. And that presence taught her something quietly profound. Healthy connection doesn't demand urgency, doesn't rush healing, doesn't arrive to save you from yourself. It simply meets you where you already stand, whole, aware, and unafraid. For the first time in years, Seraphine felt no pressure to be anything other than exactly who she was in that moment. And that, more than wealth, or setting, or circumstance, was what made the evening unforgettable. The night didn't change when Seraphine noticed the time. That, too, felt unfamiliar. In her old life, evenings were measured. How long before Calder needed to leave? How much attention she could expect before his mind drifted elsewhere? How quickly moments slipped away? Here, time passed without demand. No one checked a watch. No one rushed a conclusion. They talked until conversation gave way to comfortable quiet. Seraphine realized how rare it was to sit beside someone without feeling the need to fill space. Silence in her marriage had always felt like something to solve, an absence that needed explanation or effort. On the yacht, silence felt intentional. Restful, Aurelius didn't lean closer to create meaning. He didn't interpret pauses as invitations or withdrawals. He allowed the moment to remain exactly what it was. That restraint mattered more than grand gestures ever could. At one point, she laughed, softly, almost unexpectedly. The sound surprised her. It felt lighter than the laughter she remembered from past years, unburdened by expectation. "You sound different," Aurelius said, not as an observation meant to flatter, but as recognition. She considered his words. "I think I feel different." He nodded, satisfied with the honesty of it. They spoke then about choices, not dramatic ones, but daily ones, the kind people make quietly, without witnesses. Aurelius talked about learning, over time, that rescuing others often disguises a refusal to let them grow on their own. Support, he said, is not the same as control, and care doesn't rush. The words settled deeply. Seraphine thought about how often she had rushed herself into patience, into understanding, into silence. How she had mistaken endurance for strength. This was strength, too, choosing presence over performance, clarity over urgency, peace over proving. When the yacht eventually turned back toward the harbor, Seraphine felt no disappointment. She didn't want the night to last longer, simply to avoid returning to reality. That, she realized, was another lesson. When connection is healthy, you don't cling to it. You trust it to exist without force. As they docked, Aurelius walked her to the edge of the pier. There was no expectation in his posture, no attempt to turn the evening into something else. "I'm glad we talked," he said. "So am I," she replied. He didn't ask what came next. He didn't need to. Seraphine walked back toward the hotel alone, her steps unhurried. The harbor lights reflected softly in the water, steady and unchanging. She felt grounded, not elevated, not swept away. Grounded was better. Across the city, Calder stared at his phone once more, then finally set it aside. For the first time, he wondered if he had misunderstood silence all along. He had taken her calm as compliance, her quiet as agreement. He hadn't considered that silence could be a conclusion. Back in her room, Seraphine stood by the window and looked out at the same water she had watched earlier that evening. Nothing had changed, and everything had. She understood now that what made the night meaningful wasn't the yacht, or the man, or the setting. It was the absence of pressure, the freedom to experience connection without losing herself. That was the educational truth she carried with her. As she prepared for sleep, healthy relationships don't arrive to complete you. They arrive to meet you already whole. And when you've learned that, you no longer confuse intensity with intimacy, or silence with peace. You simply choose what feels aligned. Quietly, confidently. With argument. Calder saw the photograph by accident. That detail mattered, though he wouldn't understand why until much later. Wasn't sent to him direct. It wasn't meant to wound or provoke. It appeared casually, slipped between unrelated images in a group thread he barely paid attention to. A yacht at night, soft lights, calm water, a familiar silhouette standing near the railing. He stopped scrolling. The image sharpened as recognition settled in. Seraphine, not posed, not performing, simply present in a way he hadn't seen in years. His first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. How could she look like that already? Steady, unburdened, untouched by the weight he assumed she should be carrying. The divorce papers were barely dry. The ending still felt theoretical in his mind, something discussed, but not yet emotionally processed. He stared at the image longer than necessary. There was no man visible beside her. No obvious replacement. No narrative. he could easily attach to the moment. That unsettled him more than anything else could have. He had expected grief, if not tears, then at least visible struggle. Some sign that the ending had landed heavily on her, too. Something that affirmed the significance of what they had shared. Instead, what he saw was ease. And ease, when unexpected, raises uncomfortable questions. Calder set the phone down and stood, restless energy filling the apartment. He moved through rooms without purpose, noticing details he had overlooked for years. The absence of her belongings felt louder now, not dramatic, just final. For the first time, he allowed himself to revisit moments he had dismissed. The dinners she stopped asking about. The conversations she no longer initiated. The way her presence had softened before disappearing altogether. At the time, he had interpreted those changes as maturity, as understanding, as alignment with his pace. Now, the realization arrived with sharp clarity. She hadn't adjusted to his life. She had withdrawn from it. That distinction shifted something inside him. He replayed their last conversation, the one where he presented the divorce as a rational decision. He remembered how confident he had felt, how certain, how surprised he had been by her immediate acceptance. At the time, her calm had reassured him. Now it haunted him, because calm, he was beginning to understand, does not always mean agreement. Sometimes it means someone has already finished grieving. Calder poured a drink he didn't want and stared out at the city lights. For years, he had measured success through outcomes, wins, growth, control. He had believed that if something truly mattered, it would demand attention loudly. Seraphine had demanded nothing, and that was the mistake. He thought about how rarely he had asked her how she was feeling, really asked, without multitasking, without waiting to respond. He realized how often he had postponed emotional presence in favor of future security, assuming there would always be time to return to what he had neglected. But time, unlike money, does not wait to be reinvested. The photograph remained on his phone, untouched. It wasn't the yacht that troubled him. It was the realization that she looked at peace in a way that suggested she no longer needed him to find it. That truth settled heavily. For the first time, Calder considered the possibility that the divorce hadn't been the beginning of her moving on. It had been the confirmation, and the most difficult lesson began to form. One no boardroom or strategy session had prepared him for. Neglect does not announce its consequences immediately. It waits, and when they arrive, they do so quietly, without offering a second chance to negotiate. Calder stood there, alone with the weight of that understanding, as the image on his phone remained unchanged. Seraphine had not left in anger. She had left in readiness, and by the time he noticed, she was already gone. Calder didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the photograph replaying itself in his mind with quiet persistence. Not as an accusation, not as a betrayal, as evidence. Evidence that something had ended long before he noticed. He replayed moments he had once dismissed as insignificant. the way Seraphine's voice had softened, how her questions had shifted from curiosity to courtesy, how she had stopped weaving herself into his future plans. He had mistaken her silence for debility. Now he understood. It had been resignation. Sometime before dawn, he reached for his phone and opened their old message thread. He scrolled upward, past logistics and reminders, past efficient exchanges that now felt hollow. He searched for warmth and found it only in older messages, longer paragraphs, shared jokes, plans written with certainty. The change was undeniable. He had not lost her suddenly. He had lost her gradually, and participated in the loss without realizing it. By morning, a heaviness settled in his chest that no amount of logic could lift. This was unfamiliar territory. In business, there was always a corrective action, a way to regain leverage, a strategy to recover ground. Here, there was none. He considered reaching out. The thought lingered longer than he expected. What would he say? That he missed her? That he hadn't realized? That he wanted to talk? Each option felt insufficient. Worse, it felt late. Calder had always believed timing could be negotiated, that the right words, delivered with confidence, could reopen any conversation. But this was different. Seraphine hadn't closed a door in anger. She had walked through it calmly. Across the harbor, Seraphine woke to soft light filtering through the curtains. She stretched slowly, noticing the absence of tension in her body. For years, mornings had begun with quiet calculation. What needed to be done, what might be expected of her, what she needed to postpone. This morning asked nothing of her. She made coffee and stood by the window, watching boats glide across the water. The memory of the previous night rested gently in her thoughts, not as a turning point, but as confirmation. Confirmation that ease was possible. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Calder. She didn't open it immediately. That, too, was new. When she finally did, the words were tentative. "You seem happy." She read the message without emotion, not cold, not detached, simply clear. She considered her reply carefully, not because she feared his reaction, but because she wanted to speak truthfully. "I am," she wrote. "More." She set the phone down and returned to her coffee. The simplicity of the exchange carried a finality Calder felt immediately. There was no invitation in her response, no opening to explain or revisit, just honesty. And honesty, when it arrives without defensiveness, leaves very little room to argue. Calder stared at the screen. Long after the message stopped glowing, he felt something settle. Not quite regret, not quite acceptance. Understanding. Understanding that love does not disappear because of one decision, one moment, one mistake. It disappears when attention is postponed for too long, when presence is assumed instead of practiced. He had loved her in his way, but love, he realized too late, is not defined by intention alone. It is defined by participation. Seraphine finished her coffee and closed her notebook, feeling a quiet gratitude for the lesson she hadn't chosen, but had learned nonetheless. She hadn't won anything. She hadn't taken anything from anyone. She had simply stopped waiting, and in doing so, she had taught herself, and unknowingly taught Calder, the most difficult lesson of all. People don't leave when they stop loving you. They leave when they stop feeling seen. And once that happens, even the strongest words arrive too late to change the ending. Seraphine didn't wake up one morning feeling healed. That was another misconception she had quietly let go of. Healing, she was learning, wasn't a finish line you crossed with certainty. It was a practice, a series of small, consistent choices that slowly reshaped the way you moved through your own life. Some days felt light, others felt reflective in ways that surprised her, but none of them felt heavy in the way staying had. She returned to routines she had once abandoned without realizing it. Morning walks without destination. Long stretches of writing without interruption. Evenings spent reading instead of waiting. There was no urgency to reinvent herself. She wasn't trying to prove anything to Calder, to Aurelius, or to the version of herself that once believed endurance was the highest form of love. She simply began listening inward again. Writing became her anchor, not because she wanted to produce something, but because it allowed her to notice patterns she had ignored for years. On the page, she saw how often she had translated discomfort into patience, how frequently she had explained away neglect in the name of understanding. Seeing it written out made it impossible to dismiss. The lesson wasn't bitter. It was clarifying. She realized how easily people confuse loyalty with self-erasure, how often they remain in spaces that no longer reflect who they are, simply because leaving feels louder than staying. But staying, she now understood, had cost her far more. She also noticed something else emerging quietly within her, a sense of discernment. She no longer felt compelled to respond immediately to messages. She didn't rush decisions. She paid attention to how interactions made her feel afterward, whether they expanded her or depleted her. This wasn't avoidance. It was awareness. Aurelius remained present in her life, but never intrusive. Their conversations continued, unforced and infrequent enough to feel intentional rather than consuming. There were no declarations, no assumptions. What grew between them was not intensity, but trust. And trust, she realized, felt calm, not electric. She learned to recognize the difference. In the past, intensity had felt like proof of importance. Urgency had felt like desire. Now, she understood that those things often masked imbalance. Healthy connection didn't rush her. It didn't require her to perform or sacrifice her clarity to maintain closeness. That her where she stood, that realization reshaped how she viewed love itself. She no longer believed love should be earned through endurance. She no longer believed understanding meant tolerating absence. She no longer believed silence was something to survive rather than choose. This rebuilding wasn't loud. There were no dramatic moments of closure, no grand reinventions, just quiet alignment. She organized her days around what restored her. She made plans without apology. She declined invitations that didn't feel right. She noticed how peace felt in her body and treated it as something worth protecting. For the first time, she wasn't defining herself by what she had lost. She was defining herself by what she was no longer willing to give away. And that, she understood, was not selfish. It was educational in the most personal way possible. Because lessons can't be taught through advice or warning. They have to be lived, slowly, honestly, and without revenge. Seraphine didn't rebuild her life to prove she had survived. She rebuilt it to make sure she never disappeared again. Seraphine noticed the difference in herself the first time she said no without explaining. The invitation had been harmless, social, well-intended, even flattering. In the past, she would have accepted out of habit, then rearranged herself internally to make it work. This time, she paused, checked in with herself, and declined politely. No apology, no justification, just honesty. The ease of it startled her. She was learning that growth wasn't about adding new things to her life. It was about removing the obligation to accommodate everything that asked for her time. That awareness shaped how she approached every connection afterward, including Aurelius. He never tried to insert himself into her healing. He didn't push for clarity or define what they were becoming. When they spoke, it was intentional. When they didn't, there was no tension in the space between. One afternoon, while they walked along the harbor, she realized something quietly profound. She wasn't measuring his consistency against Calder's absence. She wasn't comparing. She was present. That, more than anything, told her she was no longer operating from loss. Aurelius noticed her thoughtfulness and asked gently, "What's on your mind?" She smiled. "I was just realizing how different this feels." "In what way?" he asked. "I don't feel like I'm being chosen," she said. "I feel like I'm choosing." He nodded, not surprised. "That's usually when things are healthiest." That sentence stayed with her long after they parted. She reflected on how often she had confused being wanted with being valued, how urgency had once felt flattering instead of alarming, how much energy she had poured into maintaining connections that asked her to compromise her inner peace. This rebuilding phase wasn't about romance. It was about standards. She became more attentive to her emotional responses. She noticed when conversations energized her versus when they drained her. She learned to trust discomfort as information rather than something to suppress. And perhaps most importantly, she learned that she didn't need to replace what she lost to validate her decision to leave. Calder faded from her daily thoughts. Not intentionally, not dramatically. He simply became part of her past rather than something she needed to process actively. That, she realized, was what closure actually looked like. Not a conversation, not an apology, not understanding, but indifference without bitterness. One evening, as she reviewed old journal entries, she noticed a pattern that made her pause. Nearly every page from the final years of her marriage included the word wait. Wait for timing. Wait for space. Wait for change. The newer pages held different language. Choose, notice, protect. She closed the notebook and sat quietly with the contrast. Growth, she understood now, wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to someone she had been before she learned to disappear. And that return didn't require replacing the past with something louder or more impressive. It required honoring herself consistently. That was the deepest lesson this chapter carried. You don't heal by proving you're wanted again. You heal by deciding you're already enough to be selective. Seraphine hadn't rebuilt her life around a person. She had rebuilt it around clarity. And clarity, once established, becomes the most powerful boundary of all. Calder waited 3 weeks before reaching out, not because he didn't want to sooner, but because he didn't know how. For most of his life, words had come easily when they were tied to outcomes. He knew how to persuade, how to negotiate, how to present a position in a way that felt undeniable. But this wasn't a deal. There was no leverage to apply, no advantage to gain. There was only truth. And truth, he was learning, doesn't bend to confidence. He drafted messages he never sent, read them back, and deleted them. Each version sounded wrong in a different way. Too casual, too apologetic, too late. He worried about saying the wrong thing. But what unsettled him most was the growing realization that the right thing might no longer matter. Still, the silence pressed in on him differently now. It wasn't the silence of peace he had once mistaken for stability. It was the silence of consequence. So one evening, after staring at his phone longer than he cared to admit, he typed a single line and pressed send before he could rethink it. "You seem happy." He stared at the message after it disappeared, his chest tight with anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Not the thrill of pursuit or the pressure of performance. Something more vulnerable. Uncertain. Across the harbor, Seraphine saw his name appear on her screen and felt nothing spike inside her. That, too, surprised her. No irritation, no nostalgia, no ache, just recognition. She didn't open the message immediately. She finished what she was doing, closed her notebook, and sat quietly for a moment, not to prepare a response, but to notice herself. She realized she wasn't bracing for impact. When she finally read the message, she understood what it really was. Not a question, a reach. She thought about everything she might say. She could explain. She could soften the truth. She could offer reassurance that made him feel better without changing anything. She chose none of those. She typed 2 words. "I am." She set the phone down. The simplicity of the reply carried a weight Calder felt immediately. There was no opening hidden in it, no invitation to continue the conversation, just clarity. And clarity, when it arrives without anger, is unmistakable. Calder sat with the response longer than he wanted to admit. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. It was honest in a way that left him nowhere to stand but where he was, alone with his understanding. He thought of how often Seraphine had waited for him to ask how she was, really ask, without distraction or delay. How often she had chosen patience over confrontation, hoping presence would return on its own. He realized now that waiting had been her gift, and silence her boundary. Seraphine returned to her evening without disruption. The message didn't linger in her thoughts or reopen old questions. It simply confirmed something she already knew. She hadn't closed the door to punish him. She had closed it because she no longer needed to stand in the doorway. And that, she understood, was the difference between leaving out of anger and leaving out of growth. The message had arrived too late, not because time had passed, but because she had moved forward, quietly, completely, without argument. Calder read her reply again the next morning. I am. 2 words. No punctuation. No explanation. He searched them for something that wasn't there. Hesitation. Softness. A crack he could widen with the right follow-up. But the message offered nothing beyond what it was. Truth. For the first time, he understood that her happiness wasn't performative. It wasn't designed to be seen or acknowledged. It simply existed, independent of him. That realization settled heavily. He walked through the apartment slowly, noticing how every room carried echoes of a life he had once assumed would always be there. The chair where she used to sit and read. The counter space she kept clear because clutter unsettled her. The quiet order she brought into places without ever announcing it. He had benefited from her presence without recognizing its cost. Calder finally admitted something to himself that had been forming for weeks. He hadn't lost Seraphine because she stopped loving him. He had lost her because he stopped noticing her. And noticing, he now realized, is an active choice. He didn't send another message, not because he lacked the words, but because he respected the boundary she had drawn without hostility. Pushing past it would only confirm the very lesson he had learned too late. Across the city, Seraphine moved through her days with a steadiness that surprised even her. The past no longer pulled at her attention. When memories surfaced, they arrived without sharpness, like photographs viewed from a distance, meaningful but no longer immersive. She noticed how much emotional energy she had reclaimed simply by not revisiting old explanations. One afternoon, she met Aurelius for coffee near the harbor. The conversation was light, unburdened by significance. They spoke about travel, about books, about the quiet satisfaction of lives shaped intentionally rather than reactively. At one point, Aurelius asked gently, "Do you ever miss it?" She considered the question honestly. "I miss who I thought we could be," she said. "But don't miss who I had to become to stay. He nodded, understanding the difference immediately. That distinction felt like closure. Seraphine realized she no longer needed to prove anything to herself or anyone else. Her life didn't require justification. Her choices didn't need validation. She had learned how to listen to herself again, and that, she understood, was the most educational part of the journey. Closure is not something someone gives you. It's something you recognize once you stop asking questions that no longer need answers. Calder, in his own way, learned something too. He learned that love doesn't end loudly when it fades from neglect. It ends quietly when the person who has been waiting finally stops. And by the time the absence becomes noticeable, the leaving has already happened. Seraphine didn't walk away with anger. She walked away with clarity. And clarity, once chosen, doesn't require a reunion to feel complete. Seraphine stopped marking time by what had happened. That, she realized, was how she knew the chapter had truly closed. There were no more mental check-ins, no quiet comparisons between who she was and who she used to be. The past existed, but it no longer narrated her present. It informed her, softly, respectfully, without demanding attention. Her days settled into a rhythm that felt intentional. Mornings belonged to her. She wrote early when the world was still undecided, letting thoughts arrive without editing them for meaning or usefulness. Writing was no longer an escape. It was return. She noticed how her body responded differently to life now. Less tension in her shoulders, fewer shallow breaths, laughter that came without effort. These weren't dramatic transformations. They were subtle confirmations that alignment had replaced endurance. Strength, she learned, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like calm consistency. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace, even when no one is watching. Aurelius remained part of her life in a way that felt natural and unforced. There was no pressure to define anything beyond what it was. They shared time, not expectations. Connection, not urgency. One afternoon, as they walked along the harbor, she paused, watching the water move steadily against the docks. "I used to think strength meant holding on," she said quietly. "And now?" He asked. "Now I know. It can mean letting go without needing to explain." He smiled, not because the answer impressed him, but because it was complete. Across the city, Calder continued adjusting to a life that required reflection instead of momentum. He didn't frame his lessons as punishment. He framed them as awareness, arriving later than he wished, but honestly, nonetheless. He learned to listen differently, to notice when silence asked for presence rather than efficiency. He learned that certainty, when unexamined, can become blindness. There was reunion. There didn't need to be. Seraphine didn't require closure from him. She had already given it to herself through action. One evening, she stood again by the water, watching lights scatter across the surface, the way they always had. The scene felt familiar. But she was not the same woman who had stood there months earlier. She was no longer someone who waited to be chosen. She was someone who chose deliberately. And that choice, quiet, firm, and deeply personal, was the foundation of everything that followed. She didn't argue the divorce because there was nothing left to defend. She didn't move forward to prove anything. She moved forward because peace had finally become non-negotiable. And once peace becomes a standard, not a reward, life begins to arrange itself differently, without force, without noise, and without regret. Seraphine understood now why her silence had unsettled everyone. The lawyer, Calder, even herself. At first, people expected endings to be loud, because loud endings are easier to categorize. They come with villains and victims, with blame that can be assigned and revisited. Quiet endings resist that structure. They offer no spectacle, only truth. And truth, when it stands on its own, needs no defense. She thought back to the moment she had signed the papers. How calm her hand had been, how certain she had felt, not because she was unafraid, but because fear no longer guided her decisions. She hadn't argued the divorce because she had already done the arguing internally. Years of conversations she rehearsed and revised, questions she swallowed, needs she learned to downplay. By the time the papers appeared, the conversation was over. That was the lesson she carried forward. That relationships don't end in the moment people acknowledge them. They end in the moments when someone stops feeling safe enough to speak honestly and chooses silence instead. Seraphine didn't leave to be admired. She didn't leave to be chased. She left to remain whole. The yacht, the billionaire, the photograph that traveled farther than intention ever could. None of that defined her story. Those were details the world used to simplify what it didn't understand. The real story was quieter. It was about a woman who learned that love should not require shrinking, that patience should not demand self-erasure. That peace is not something you earn by enduring discomfort. It is something you choose by honoring yourself. Calder learned his lesson too, though it arrived later than he wished. He learned that neglect doesn't announce itself with cruelty. It shows up as absence, as distraction, as assuming someone will always be there because they always have been. He learned that when someone stops asking, it isn't because they no longer care. It's because they have stopped believing their voice matters. Seraphine stood at the harbor one last time before leaving the city, watching the water move with steady purpose. She felt no bitterness, no triumph, only gratitude for the clarity she had earned through living honestly. She didn't know exactly where life would lead next. She didn't need to. She had learned to trust herself again. And that trust, quiet, firm, and deeply rooted, was the most valuable thing she carried forward. The world would always misunderstand silence, but she never would again. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness, is resolution. And resolution, once reached, doesn't argue. It moves on. If this story stayed with you, don't rush away from it. Have you ever realized that the quiet choices, the ones no one applauds, are the ones that change your life the most? If Seraphine's journey resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflection might be exactly what someone else needs to read right now. And if you believe stories can heal, teach, and remind us of our worth, subscribe to the channel. Here at Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, every story is written to entertain, but also to leave you stronger than you were before. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until the next story, choose peace without apology.